Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today, a requested topic on the difference between a paradox and a contradiction. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they're actually quite different. They're in different logical categories, we could say. And I'm actually going to introduce a third term here, the irony, which shows that paradox actually has more in common, as per these black dots, with irony than it does with contradiction, even though paradoxes often seem like contradictions. Okay? So the first difference, and this is a necessary, and actually this is a sufficient condition for determining that paradox and contradiction are different things, is that a contradiction must be false under all circumstances, whereas a paradox can be true or false. Its identity as a paradox does not weigh on its truth value, okay? So an irony is similar in that regard. Black dot, remember? So the next line, one way that they are similar, however, is that they are both truth claims. There is an intention behind the use of both a paradox and a contradiction, that it is stating something that has a truth value, right? It just turns out to be the case, but that's a matter of intention, right? It just turns out to be the case that a contradiction is always false, and for a paradox, it doesn't actually matter. An irony, by contrast, is actually more of a literary tool or a literary effect that we can observe. There is no intention of truth or falsity behind it. So third line, and we're going to get into the psychology in a minute, but this is still a purely logical matter, right? This is a logical difference. A contradiction is a priori knowledge, which means that its truth value, it being false, is intrinsic to its very form, its structure. So it violates a law of logic, the law that is the law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot simultaneously exist and not exist. That is what a contradiction is. And a contradiction violates that law. And its violating of that law is intrinsic to the statement itself, the form, the structure of it, not, it has no regard whatsoever for our experience of it. But that is the case in a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori knowledge is justified by the use of our experience, our observation, scientific validation, so on and so forth. And that is the case for paradox and irony. They are a posteriori matters. And our experience of both of them is such that we expect one thing, but the outcome turns out differently, right? So for something to be a paradox, it requires of us that we expect a certain outcome that, there seems to be an invalidation within the statement, but it turns out that perhaps there isn't, or perhaps there is a lack of logical grounding in our expectation, right? Irony is also dependent on an incongruity between what we expect and what we get. But it is more, again, of a literary tool that produces comic relief. Again, it's not attempting to be true or false. It's just something that we can observe that can produce comic relief. It's not really a necessary condition, but often it is the case that irony is funny, right? So these two seem invalid because of our perception of it. Irony and paradox depend on our perception, on our psychological state, based in a logical error, right? We think there's a contradiction, but really there may not be, okay? A paradox can also be a contradiction, but it is not necessary. And I'll get to that in a second, right? So essentially, a paradox causes us to inquire more deeply about that false logical presupposition that we had. We basically raised in irony something that is incongruent and seems invalid to the level of a logical rule. But it turns out that there was no rule there to begin with, and it's not a contradiction, therefore it is a paradox. So it causes in us some tension. Because generally speaking, people don't like to dig a little deeper and find out why they're wrong or why they were misled about something, Which leads us to contradiction. What does that produce? Angry motherfuckers. Because people don't like to be wrong. If you point out a contradiction in someone's statement that this statement is incompatible logically with another statement that they said, and they can't offer an explanation as to why it is compatible, then, that can produce anger in them. So essentially, irony is an illogical thing because, again, it's not a truth claim. It doesn't fall into the category of logical statement, right? Although there's some logic in it that causes us to be misled incongruity-wise, but that's purely on a psychological level, not on a logical level. There's nothing intrinsic to the statement itself that makes it true or false or, valid or invalid. But it produces comic relief. It's more lighthearted. A paradox, yes, there was that expectation there that we were going to get something different than the outcome that was produced. Seems invalid because there's that incongruity, right? So it causes some tension. But so it's logic misapplied. It's essentially the case that both irony and paradox are inductive. You use inductive reasoning to figure out the incongruity between what you expected and what you got. But it is not necessary that is deductive, like a contradiction. Deductive logic requires us to analyze something in terms, or analyze a statement in terms of its structure, its form alone, right? So in order to demonstrate the difference between these things, I want to use an example, and that is the case of a ship called Old Blue. Old Blue started its life as a blue ship, okay? Let's say it transported oil to Port Fouchon, all right? Now, over the years, it underwent a lot of maintenance, and all of the physical components were eventually replaced. And now the ship is red, not blue, even though we still call it Old Blue. And it still serves the same purpose in delivering oil to Port Fouchon, Louisiana. It is ironic that we still call the ship Old Blue, even though it's now red. It's logically arbitrary. It doesn't matter. It's not actually incorrect for us to call it Old Blue, even though it's now red, because remember, a title that we give something is a proper noun. A proper noun is just a label that we give something to differentiate between one object and all other objects when we're addressing it or referring to it in conversation. So it's arbitrary. It doesn't bear on any sort of logical rule, right? Doesn't matter. It seems, now let's say that you take a correspondence theory of truth, and what I just said about logic, about language, that proper names are arbitrary, doesn't apply to your philosophy. Let's say you make a logical rule of correspondence theory of truth. Let's say that you believe in correspondence theory of truth, which means that all statements that we make have a corresponding fact or object or state of affairs in the world that we can point to. Now, there are problems with this metaphysical theory that I'm not going to quite get into right now, but it seems contradictory to you that we call the ship Old Blue, even though it's red. But it's not a contradiction, it's merely paradoxical, because there is not actually a rule that states that there's anything wrong with that in logic, right? Now, let's talk about the ship's identity, right? All the components since the beginning of its life have changed. So it is physically a different thing, right? Now, if you're a materialist, that basically implies that you believe in correspondence theory of truth, you identify a ship in terms of its physical components. That is the definition of a ship for you, is basically a list of physical components that work, right? Actually, you don't even have to work, because in that case, you would have to be working towards something, which would imply a goal, which is impossible in the school of thought of materialism. But anyway, this is a matter of identity. This is a matter of logic. Is the ship the same ship, even though all of its physical components have been changed? Right? Is there something essential, an essential quality that has remained in the ship since the time of its birth, even though all of its physical components have changed? Is it the same ship? Well, it depends how we define ship, right? So that's where contradiction and logic come into play. We have to have certain logical presuppositions, right, about what constitutes a ship, how we define it. And a more sophisticated definition of ship, rather than a list of its physical components, would be that it is a seagoing vessel. And in particular, in the case of Old Blue, a seagoing vessel that transports fuel to Port Fourchon, Louisiana. Well, if we presuppose this definition of Old Blue the ship, then there is no contradiction here. It has maintained the same identity as it always has, right? But we could still say that it's paradoxical on a material basis, because it seems like a different ship on the basis of its different physical components, even though it maintains the same essential, logical, even metaphysical identity. So anyway, that's the difference between irony, paradox, and contradiction. Contradiction is an a priori deductive issue. It is invalid, it is a truth claim, and it must be false all the time. It is in the category of a logical rule. It breaks the rule of non-contradiction in logic. Whereas a paradox and an irony are more matter of psychology rather than logic. They are dependent on not their own form, but on our perception of them. That there is an incongruity between what we expect and what the outcome actually is. So this is more psychological. This is logical. Hope that was clear. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one, guys. Cheers.